The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our modern apartment. It was a picture-perfect morning, something out of a lifestyle magazine. The smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air as James moved effortlessly around the kitchen. He always started his day like this, methodical and precise, as if his life was a series of checkboxes to be marked off. "Today's going to be a long one," he said, pouring coffee into a sleek ceramic mug. "Back-to-back meetings, and I promised Ted I'd review the quarterly report." I nodded, absent-mindedly, pretending to listen as my hands rested on the spine of an unopened book. James was good at this: planning, strategizing, solving problems. He excelled at everything he did. But lately, I'd started to notice a gap between us, an invisible wall of habits and routines that neither of us dared to address. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his voice tinged with genuine concern. "Yeah, fine," I replied, offering him a smile that felt rehearsed. Inside, my mind wandered back to last week, the family dinner. The way Victor had looked at me, his gaze lingering just long enough to stir something I didn't fully understand. His voice, deep, calm, and laced with quiet authority, had echoed in my thoughts ever since. Later that afternoon, I decided to go to the gym. It was one of the few places where I could clear my head, or at least attempt to. The rhythmic hum of treadmills and the clinking of weights provided a kind of white noise that drowned out my restless thoughts. I was adjusting the settings on a machine when I heard his voice. "Need a hand?" I turned, and there he was. Victor, dressed in a plain black t-shirt that clung to his broad shoulders, and charcoal gray sweatpants. He looked casual, yet composed, as if he belonged everywhere. "Sure," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. He adjusted the weight for me, his fingers brushing mine briefly. "You shouldn't push too hard at the start. Build up to it." His advice was simple, but the way he said it made my pulse quicken. We exchanged a few more words, polite, measured, but the air between us was heavy with something unspoken. He complimented my form, something about how I carried myself with confidence, and I laughed it off, pretending not to notice the spark that passed between us. When he walked away, I caught myself watching him, and a faint blush crept into my cheeks. What was I doing? The drive home was a blur of half-formed thoughts. The cityscape zipped past my window, a kaleidoscope of motion and color. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, as if grounding myself could keep my mind from spiraling. What was it about him? Was it the way he carried himself, so assured and effortless? Or was it the quiet understanding in his eyes, as if he could see parts of me that even I couldn't? I shook my head, scolding myself silently. It was nothing, a momentary lapse. Victor was my stepfather, not by blood, but by circumstance, a detail that didn't make my thoughts any less inappropriate. When I arrived home, James was at his desk, focused on his laptop. He looked up briefly, offering me a warm smile. "How was your workout?" "Good," I said, forcing another smile. I wanted to tell him everything, to confess this sudden, inexplicable attraction, and let him reassure me that it was nothing. But how could I? Even admitting it felt like a betrayal. So I swallowed my words and leaned into the predictable comfort of our routine, trying to convince myself that it was enough. Yet deep down, a part of me was already waiting for the next time I'd see Victor. The hum of conversation filled the house as another family dinner unfolded. Laughter and clinking glasses created a warm backdrop, but I felt like an outsider in my own home. The evening had been orchestrated by my mother, Megan, with her typical precision. Everything was perfect, on the surface at least. I drifted into the kitchen, craving a moment of solitude away from the polished conversations about vacations, promotions, and wine pairings. As I poured myself a glass of water, I felt his presence before I saw him. Victor stepped into the room, his movements deliberate, yet unassuming. He had a way of commanding attention without demanding it. "Escaping the crowd?" he asked, his voice smooth and low. I nodded, suddenly hyper-aware of the way the fabric of my dress clung to my skin under his gaze. Needed a break, I said, trying to sound casual. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. That color suits you, you know. Brings out your confidence. A compliment, harmless on the surface, but the way he said it, with a faint smile that barely reached his eyes, sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced away, pretending to adjust my glass. You always notice things like that? I asked, attempting a light-hearted tone. Only when they're worth noticing, he replied, his gaze steady. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier. I wanted to respond with something witty, something to defuse the tension, but my mind betrayed me. All I could feel was the electric charge between us, unspoken yet undeniable. The evening dragged on, and when it was finally time to leave, I breathed a sigh of relief. The cool night air hit my skin as I stepped outside, wrapping myself in my coat. Victor appeared moments later, offering to walk me to my car. It was a simple gesture, one that shouldn't have meant anything, but my heart raced all the same. You seemed quiet tonight, he said as we reached my car. Everything okay? I hesitated, my hand resting on the car door. Just tired, I guess. These dinners can be exhausting. He nodded, stepping closer. I get that, but you shouldn't let it wear you down. You have a light about you, Lori. Don't let it dim. The way he said my name, soft, intimate, felt like an unraveling. I turned to face him, searching for something in his expression. Was it concern? Admiration? Something darker? Victor, I began, but the words caught in my throat. He reached out, his hand brushing my arm, a touch so subtle yet charged with intent. Before I could think, before I could process, his lips found mine. It was brief, a whisper of a kiss, but it ignited something in me I couldn't contain. I pulled back, my breath shallow, my mind spinning. I'm sorry, he murmured, his voice thick with regret. Or was it something else? I shouldn't have, but I was already shaking my head, fumbling for my car keys. I have to go, I said, my voice barely audible. I got into the car and drove away, my hands gripping the wheel like a lifeline. The city lights blurred as tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. What just happened? And why, despite the guilt gnawing at my chest, did I want it to happen again? When I arrived home, James was in the living room, reviewing documents on his laptop. He looked up as I walked in, his face lighting up with that familiar, dependable smile. Hey, how was dinner? He asked. Fine, I replied, dropping my coat onto the back of a chair. My voice sounded strained even to me, but he didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he chose not to. You look tired, he said, standing to kiss me on the forehead. Why don't you get some rest? I'll finish up here. Yeah, good idea, I muttered, retreating to the bedroom. As I sat on the edge of the bed, the events of the night replayed in my mind. Victor's touch, his words, his kiss. They consumed me. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to step back or let myself fall. Why? I whispered to the empty room. Why him? Why now? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that everything had changed in an instant, and there was no going back. Sitting at my kitchen table the next morning, I stared at my phone. The house was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of papers from James in the study. My fingers hovered over the screen, debating whether to type out the message I'd been rehearsing in my head for hours. Hi, Victor. I was thinking about what happened. Maybe we should talk? No, too direct. Victor, I wanted to ask you something about the family dinner. Too obvious. After minutes that felt like hours, I settled on a safer option. Hi, Victor. I realized I forgot to mention something about Mom's plans for the holidays. Can we meet? It was vague, innocuous. At least, that's what I told myself. I hit send, my heart pounding, as I waited for the ellipse to appear. When his response came, it was quick and precise. Sure, Let me know when you're free. We met at a small cafe on the quieter side of the city. It was a place I chose intentionally, far from familiar faces. Victor was already seated when I arrived, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup as he scanned the menu. He looked up when I approached, his expression neutral, but his eyes gave away a flicker of something deeper. Lori, he greeted, standing briefly before motioning for me to sit. What's on your mind? His tone was casual, but the weight of our last encounter hung heavily between us. I hesitated, fiddling with the handle of my bag, before blurting out, I just thought we should clear the air after, you know. Victor's lips quirked into a half smile. After the kiss, you mean? The way he said it, so matter of fact, so unashamed, made my pulse quicken. I looked away, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. It was a mistake, I said, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. Was it? He asked, leaning forward slightly. His voice was low, steady, drawing me in despite my better judgment. It has to be, I replied, more to convince myself than him. You're my stepfather, he finished for me. By title, yes. But you and I both know that's not the whole story. I opened my mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt his hand brush against mine as he reached for his cup. It was subtle, deliberate. The contact sent a shiver up my spine, and for a moment, I forgot where we were. Victor, I began, pulling my hand back. This can't happen. It's wrong. And yet, here we are, he said simply. The silence that followed was thick with tension. I stood abruptly, needing to escape before I said or did something I couldn't take back. I should go, I said, grabbing my bag. Lori, Victor called after me, his voice softer now. You can keep pretending, or you can admit the truth, to yourself at least. I didn't look back as I walked out, but his words followed me all the way home. At home, James was waiting with a bottle of wine and a hopeful smile. I thought we could have a quiet night together, he said, gesturing toward the neatly set dining table. I forced a smile, nodding as I hung up my coat. That sounds nice. But as the evening wore on, I found it harder to focus. James talked about his day, about a new client at work, about his plans for the weekend. I responded when prompted, but my mind was elsewhere, back in the cafe, replaying every word, every glance, every fleeting touch. You're quiet tonight, James observed, reaching across the table to take my hand. His touch was warm, familiar, but it lacked the spark I couldn't stop craving. Just tired, I lied, pulling my hand away to refill my glass. He didn't press, but I could see the concern in his eyes. Later, when he leaned in to kiss me goodnight, I turned my face slightly, letting his lips brush my cheek instead. He hesitated, pulling back to study me. Everything okay? He asked. Of course, I replied quickly. I've just had a lot on my mind. He nodded, though his expression remained uncertain. As he turned off the lights and climbed into bed, I stayed behind, staring at my reflection in the darkened window. What was wrong with me? James was everything I should want. Kind, stable, devoted. But as much as I hated myself for it, I couldn't stop comparing him to Victor. His certainty felt stifling, where Victor's unpredictability felt exhilarating. The guilt was unbearable, but it wasn't enough to silence the thought that kept surfacing, no matter how hard I tried to push it away. I wanted more. The bustling restaurant hummed with energy as waiters darted between tables and conversations overlapped in a symphony of city life. I sat across from Emma, swirling my glass of water absently as she launched into another story about her latest misadventure at work. Her voice, normally full of sarcasm and wit, barely registered with me. Are you even listening? She asked, narrowing her eyes. Of course, I lied, offering a weak smile. Something about your boss being a dictator again? She sighed, shaking her head. You're off in your own world lately. What's going on, Lori? Trouble in paradise? I hesitated, fiddling with the edge of the napkin. No, everything's fine, just work stress, I guess. Emmy didn't buy it, but she let it slide, moving on to her next topic. I nodded along, forcing responses when necessary, but my attention was elsewhere. Or rather, on someone else. I saw him before he saw me. Victor, seated alone at the bar, his posture relaxed as he scanned the menu. He was dressed in a dark blazer over a crisp white shirt, effortlessly commanding attention. My pulse quickened, and I immediately looked away, hoping he wouldn't notice me. Earth to Lori, Emmy said, waving a hand in front of my face. You're seriously out of it. I'm fine, I insisted, but the sudden dryness in my throat betrayed me. When Emmy finally got up to take a phone call, I considered bolting. But before I could gather my things, Victor appeared at my table, a casual smile playing on his lips. Small world, he said, pulling out the chair Emmy had just vacated. Mind if I join you? Victor, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. What are you doing here? Having lunch, same as you, he replied, leaning back in the chair as if we were old friends catching up. Your friend won't mind, will she? I glanced toward the entrance, where Emma was still animatedly gesturing into her phone. She won't be long, I said, my tone sharper than intended. Victor raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his expression. Relax, Lori, I'm not here to cause trouble. We fell into a conversation that was both maddeningly casual and loaded with subtext. He asked about my work, my hobbies, even about James. Each question felt like a test, his tone light but his eyes piercing. I tried to keep my answers neutral, but the tension was palpable. You always seem so composed, he remarked, his voice dropping slightly, but I can't help wondering what's going on beneath the surface. Before I could respond, Em returned, shooting Victor a curious look. Friend of yours? She asked. Family, I said quickly, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. Victor, this is Emma. They exchanged polite nods, but the energy at the table had shifted. Emma's presence was a buffer, keeping our conversation safely superficial until she excused herself again, this time to pay the bill. As soon as she left, Victor leaned in slightly, his voice low. You didn't tell me you'd be here, trying to avoid me? It's not like that, I said, my heart pounding. This is just coincidence, he finished, a sly smile tugging at his lips. But it's funny, isn't it? How often these coincidences seem to happen. I stood abruptly, grabbing my bag. I should go. Victor rose with me, his expression unreadable. Let me walk you out. The cold air outside was a stark contrast to the warmth of the restaurant, biting at my skin as Victor fell into step beside me. When we reached my car, I turned to face him, ready to say goodbye, but the words caught in my throat. His gaze held mine, steady and unyielding, and before I could stop myself, I whispered, This has to stop. Does it? He asked, his voice barely audible. I opened my mouth to argue, but he stepped closer, his hand brushing my arm in a way that sent a jolt through me. The space between us disappeared, and then his lips were on mine. This time, there was no hesitation, no restraint. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened, igniting something I couldn't control. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless, my mind spinning. Victor's expression was a mix of desire and something darker, something I couldn't name. This is wrong, I said, my voice shaky. We can't. But we are, he interrupted, and pretending otherwise won't change it. I turned and got into my car, gripping the steering wheel as I tried to steady my breathing. My reflection in the rearview mirror was a stranger's face, flushed, disheveled, and utterly confused. When I got home, James was waiting, a small gift box in hand. I thought I'd surprise you, he said, his smile warm and genuine. Inside the box was a delicate bracelet, something I might have adored under different circumstances. Thank you, I said, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. He pulled me into a hug, but instead of comfort, I felt a wave of guilt crash over me. As he held me, his warmth only highlighted the emptiness inside me, a void I knew Victor could fill. That night, as James slept soundly beside me, I stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the kiss. I was losing myself, and the worst part was, I didn't want to stop. Victor's invitation came unexpectedly, though I'd been half expecting it ever since our kiss outside the restaurant. His message was as carefully worded as ever. Let's talk. It's about your mother's plans for the holidays. My place tomorrow evening. It was practical, impersonal, on the surface. But I knew better. This wasn't about family logistics, and we both knew it. Despite the alarm bells ringing in my head, I found myself agreeing. His apartment was everything I expected. Sleek, modern, and impeccably arranged. The kind of place that reflected his character. Controlled, composed, but with subtle touches of warmth. A framed photo of him and my mother on a vacation they'd taken hung on the wall, a glaring reminder of how wrong this was. Drink? He asked, already pouring a glass of wine. Just water, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He raised an eyebrow but didn't comment, handing me a glass and gesturing toward the couch. I sat on the edge, my body tense, clutching the glass as if it were an anchor. So, I began, searching for something to say. You mentioned holiday plans? Victor leaned against the back of the chair across from me, his posture relaxed, but his eyes intent. Do we really need to pretend that's why you're here? The question hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. I opened my mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze never leaving mine. Lori, he said softly, his voice both gentle and commanding. Why are you really here? I don't know, I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I don't know what I'm doing, or why I— Because it feels real, he interrupted, his tone steady but not unkind. Because for once you're not following the script. His words struck a chord I didn't want to acknowledge. He was right. For all the guilt and confusion swirling inside me, there was also a spark of something undeniable, something that had been missing from my life for far too long. I can't do this, I whispered, shaking my head. Victor stood and crossed the room, stopping just short of where I sat. He didn't touch me, not yet, but his presence was overwhelming. Then tell me to stop, he said simply. I looked up at him, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. He reached out, his hand brushing against my cheek, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. His touch was light, almost hesitant, but it set my entire body alight. You should go, he murmured, though his hand didn't move. Do you want me to? I asked, my voice trembling. No, he admitted, his thumb grazing my jawline. But I will if that's what you want. I couldn't answer. Instead, I leaned into his touch, my breath hitching as his hand slid to the back of my neck. The tension that had been building for weeks finally snapped as his lips found mine. This kiss was different. It wasn't rushed or fleeting. It was deliberate, consuming, and it left no room for doubt. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer as the world outside his apartment disappeared. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt seen, desired, alive. When we finally pulled apart, I couldn't bring myself to look at him. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me like a vice. The drive home was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, as I tried to process everything. The guilt was immediate and suffocating, but it was accompanied by something far more dangerous, a sense of longing. When I walked through the door, James was in the kitchen, humming to himself as he prepared dinner. He turned and smiled when he saw me, his face lighting up with that familiar, dependable warmth. Hey, he said, crossing the room to kiss me on the forehead. You're home early. How was your day? Fine, I replied automatically, avoiding his eyes as I slipped off my coat. You've been working so hard lately, he said, his voice full of concern. We should plan a getaway, just the two of us. What do you think? That sounds nice, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But even as I said the words, I felt a chasm growing between us. His kindness, his stability, they should have been enough. They always had been before. But now they only served to highlight the chaos inside me. That night, as James slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My thoughts were a whirlwind of regret and desire, shame and exhilaration. I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I wanted to. I told myself I wouldn't go. I repeated it like a mantra, each word a desperate attempt to tether myself to reason. But when his message came, simple, unassuming, "Tonight, 8 p.m. I need to see you," I knew I wouldn't resist. By the time I arrived at his apartment, my resolve had crumbled entirely. The hallway felt endless as I approached his door, my heels clicking against the polished floor. When Victor opened it, his expression was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed something raw, something that mirrored the storm inside me. "You came," he said, stepping aside to let me in. I nodded, unable to form words. The apartment was dimly lit, the atmosphere intimate, but not staged. He hadn't prepared for this. It wasn't a seduction, it was something far more dangerous. We sat across from each other on the couch, the silence stretching like a taut wire. He handed me a glass of wine, but I barely touched it. My fingers fidgeted with the stem, a nervous energy buzzing through me. "You don't have to stay," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "If you want to leave, I won't stop you." "Do you want me to leave?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I want a lot of things I shouldn't," he said, his gaze locking onto mine. "But wanting doesn't make it right." I set the glass down and leaned back, my chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. "Then why did you ask me to come?" "Because I'm weak," he admitted, his tone laced with self-loathing. "And because I know you're feeling the same thing I am." The honesty in his words cut through me, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. I felt tears sting my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Instead, I moved toward him, the distance between us dissolving in an instant. "Victor," I whispered, my voice breaking. He reached for me, his hand cradling my face as if I might shatter. The kiss that followed wasn't hesitant or measured. It was a culmination, a surrender. His lips were warm, insistent, and I gave in completely, letting the world outside his apartment fade into nothingness. I didn't know how much time had passed when we finally pulled away. My body was pressed against his, the rhythm of our breaths the only sound in the room. He ran his fingers through my hair, his touch tender yet tinged with something I couldn't quite name, regret perhaps. "You shouldn't have come," he murmured, his lips brushing my forehead. "Neither should you have asked," I countered, my voice barely audible. Victor sighed, pulling me closer. "I can't keep doing this, Lori. It's not just you, it's me. I don't know where this ends, but I know it's nowhere good." For a moment, I let myself believe him. I let myself imagine walking away, returning to the life I'd built with James, and pretending this never happened. But the thought felt hollow, a lie I couldn't live with. "Do you regret it?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he cupped my face in his hands and kissed me again, slower this time, as if trying to memorize every detail. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were dark with an emotion I couldn't place. "No," he said, his voice steady, "but that's what scares me." The drive home was suffocating. The weight of what we'd done pressed down on me, each mile feeling like an eternity. I replayed the night over and over in my mind, torn between the ecstasy of being with him and the crushing guilt that followed. When I walked through the door, the house was dark. James had left a note on the counter. "Worked late. Went to bed early. Love you." The words stung more than they should have. I crumpled the note in my hand, the tears I'd held back finally spilling over. I felt fractured, caught between two lives, two versions of myself. I climbed into bed, careful not to wake James. He stirred slightly, his hand brushing against mine in his sleep. The gesture was so small, so innocent, and it broke something in me. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I told myself this had to stop, that I couldn't keep living like this. But as much as I wanted to believe it, a deeper, darker part of me knew the truth. I wasn't ready to let go. The subtle cracks in my carefully constructed facade began to show, and James, ever observant, was the first to notice. It started with small things. The way I avoided his touch, how I seemed distracted during our conversations, my newfound habit of keeping my phone close, even in the privacy of our home. "You're distant lately," he said one evening as we sat in the living room. He closed his laptop and turned to me, his brow furrowed. "Is everything okay?" I forced a smile, feigning nonchalance. "Of course, just a lot on my mind. Work's been stressful." He nodded slowly, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. James wasn't one to pry, but his silence was more unsettling than any confrontation. It was the kind of quiet that felt like the calm before a storm. Victor and I continued to communicate, our messages filled with coded words and implied meanings. It was a dangerous game, one I should have stopped playing. But the thrill of his words, the connection I felt every time my phone buzzed, was too intoxicating to give up. One afternoon, while juggling texts with Victor and work emails, I forgot a crucial rule. Always delete everything. A single notification slipped through, a fragment of our secret conversation displayed on the lock screen for just a moment too long. James saw it. The message was simple. "Tonight? Usual spot." It could have meant anything, but the look on James's face as he handed me my phone said he thought otherwise. "You got a text," he said, his voice calm but cold. "Thanks," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. Our eyes met, and for a split second, I thought he might confront me. But he didn't. Instead, he turned and left the room, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. The next day, Victor and I met in the park. It was a place we'd chosen for its anonymity, a space large enough to disappear into the crowd. He was already there when I arrived, leaning against a tree, his hands in his pockets. "You're late," he said, his tone light but his expression serious. "James saw a message," I blurted out, skipping the pleasantries. Victor's jaw tightened, and he ran a hand through his hair. "How much did he see?" "Not much," I admitted, though the weight of what could have happened hung heavily between us. He exhaled sharply, glancing around as if expecting someone to overhear. "Lori, this is getting out of hand. We can't keep doing this." I froze, his words hitting me like a physical blow. "You're ending it?" "I'm saying we need to stop before it all comes crashing down," he said, his voice firm but laced with regret. "Before we ruin everything." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "It's too late for that, Victor. Don't pretend like you don't feel it too. You can't just walk away from this." His eyes softened, and for a moment, he looked as conflicted as I felt. "You don't understand what's at stake here," he said, shaking his head. "For both of us." "I understand perfectly," I shot back. "But I'm not ready to let this go. Are you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for my hand, his touch hesitant but grounding. "You make it hard to say no," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I squeezed his hand, my heart pounding. "Then don't." The silence between us was thick with unspoken fears and desires, but neither of us moved. For all his words about stopping, I knew he wasn't ready to end it any more than I was. When I returned home, James was waiting. He sat at the kitchen table, his expression unreadable. My stomach twisted as I walked in, but he said nothing, only offering me a tight smile before disappearing into his study. The shadows between us grew darker, and though he didn't voice his suspicions, I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. The corporate gala was held in one of the city's most prestigious venues, a sprawling hall with vaulted ceilings and glistening chandeliers. James, ever the composed professional, looked every bit the part in his tailored suit. He smiled and exchanged pleasantries with colleagues, his charm as effortless as always. I stayed close to his side, playing the role of the supportive wife, but my mind was elsewhere. Victor was here. I spotted him across the room, his presence commanding even in the crowd. He stood near the bar, engaging in light conversation with a group of executives. Our eyes met briefly, and my breath caught. He didn't smile, didn't nod, just a fleeting glance that said everything and nothing. "Isn't that Victor?" James asked casually, his tone betraying none of the tension I felt. "Yes," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I didn't know he'd be here." James studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "He does some consulting for the company. I invited him myself." The revelation hit me like a tidal wave, but I forced a neutral expression. "That's nice," I said, taking a sip of champagne to steady my nerves. The evening wore on, each moment feeling like a carefully orchestrated performance. Victor and I avoided direct interaction, but the tension between us was palpable. Every accidental glance, every fleeting moment of proximity felt like a live wire, threatening to spark. James, ever observant, seemed unusually attentive. His gaze lingered on me a little too long, his smile a little too tight. At one point, I caught him watching as Victor and I exchanged polite nods across the room. His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. "Are you feeling okay?" James asked later, his hand resting lightly on my back. "Just tired," I replied, offering him a weak smile. "It's been a long day." He didn't respond, but the weight of his silence was suffocating. Later that night, as we prepared for bed, James noticed the bracelet on my wrist. It was a delicate piece, simple yet elegant, one Victor had given me weeks ago. I'd worn it out of habit, forgetting its significance in the haze of the evening's events. "That's a nice bracelet," James said, his tone carefully neutral. "Thanks," I replied, my pulse quickening. "Where did you get it?" "Emmy gave it to me," I lied, the words tumbling out before I could think them through. James raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. He turned away, but I could feel the weight of his suspicion. The next morning, I found him in his study, staring at his laptop. He looked up as I entered, his expression calm but distant. "Do you want to tell me what's going on?" he asked, his voice steady. "What do you mean?" I asked, feigning ignorance. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes searching mine. "I've been noticing things, Lori. You're distracted, you're distant, and now this bracelet. You're sure Emmy gave it to you?" I hesitated, and the pause was all he needed. He didn't press further, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind. That evening, as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, James approached me. He placed his hands on the counter, his posture tense. "I think we need to talk," he said, his voice low. I froze, my heart pounding. "About what?" "About us," he replied, his eyes locked onto mine. "About what's really going on." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I turned away, busied myself with the task at hand, and muttered, "Not tonight, James." "I'm tired." His silence was deafening, and as he left the room, I felt the walls closing in. I knew the confrontation was inevitable, but for now, I'd bought myself a little more time. The cracks in our marriage had grown too large to ignore, and with every passing moment, I felt the fragile balance of my double life slipping away. The question wasn't if James would uncover the truth. It was when. The tension in the house had become unbearable. James's sharp glances and heavy silences spoke louder than any words, and I knew the confrontation was inevitable. One evening, as I cleared the dinner table, he finally broke the silence. "Lori," he began, his voice steady but low, "are you seeing someone else?" The question, though expected, hit me like a punch to the chest. I turned to him, clutching the edge of the counter. Every instinct screamed at me to deny it, to preserve the fragile illusion we had left. But I couldn't. The weight of my guilt pressed down on me, and the truth slipped out before I could stop it. Yes, I whispered, barely audible. James didn't move. He didn't yell or lash out. Instead, he stood there, his expression a mix of resignation and quiet devastation. I knew, he said finally, his voice hollow. I've known for a while. I just needed to hear it from you. His words left me stunned. I'd expected anger, accusations, even shouting, but his calmness was worse. It was as if he'd already accepted my betrayal, and the realization made my shame unbearable. I opened my mouth to explain, to apologize, but the words caught in my throat. James turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the crushing weight of what I'd done. Victor called me the next day. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of finality in his tone that I couldn't ignore. I'm leaving, he said. I can't stay here, not after everything that's happened. Victor, please, I began, but he interrupted. It's over, Lori. What we had, it's destroyed too much. Staying would only make things worse. I sat in stunned silence, gripping the phone tightly as his words sank in. Part of me wanted to beg him to stay, to fight for what we had. But deep down, I knew he was right. Our relationship had been a wildfire, intense, consuming, and ultimately destructive. I'm sorry, he added softly, for everything. When the call ended, I felt an ache in my chest that I couldn't name. Losing Victor felt like losing a part of myself, but the guilt that followed was even worse. The next morning, James packed his things. He moved with a quiet efficiency, folding clothes and stacking books into boxes without a word. I stood in the doorway, my heart breaking with every item he placed in his suitcase. You don't have to go, I said finally, my voice trembling. We can try to fix this. He paused, looking up at me with an expression that was both kind and devastating. There's nothing to fix, Lori, he said gently. What we had, it's gone. Tears welled in my eyes as I watched him close his suitcase and zip it shut. I'm sorry, I whispered, but the words felt hollow. So am I, he replied, his voice soft but firm. But sorry doesn't change what happened. He picked up his suitcase and walked to the door. For a moment, I thought he might turn back, that he might say something, anything, to soften the finality of his departure. But he didn't. The door closed behind him, and the sound echoed through the empty house. I sat on the couch, staring at the space where his suitcase had been moments before. The silence was deafening, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the full weight of my choices. Victor was gone. James was gone. And I was alone, left to sift through the wreckage of the life I'd destroyed. As I looked around the quiet house, I realized that the freedom I'd craved so desperately now felt like a prison. I had thought that pursuing my desires would make me whole, but all it had done was tear me apart. The house felt hollow without James. Every creak of the floorboards, every echo of my footsteps seemed to amplify the silence. I wandered from room to room, unable to settle, my mind replaying the events that had led me to this moment. The weight of my choices bore down on me, and for the first time, I truly saw the damage I had caused. Victor was gone. James was gone. I had driven them both away, chasing a fleeting sense of passion, of something more. Now, standing in the ruins of what I once called my life, I realized how blind I had been. My longing for excitement, for a spark, had consumed me, leaving nothing but ashes. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty space beside me. James's side of the bed was untouched, a cold reminder of his absence. The faint scent of his cologne still lingered on the pillow, a cruel echo of what I'd lost. Tears welled in my eyes, but I didn't wipe them away. I let them fall, letting the pain wash over me. What had I been searching for? I asked myself that question repeatedly, but the answer remained elusive. Was it the thrill of something forbidden? The need to feel wanted in a way that James, for all his stability and care, couldn't provide? Or was it something deeper, an emptiness within me that no one else could fill? Days turned into weeks, and life moved on around me, though I remained frozen in place. The world outside was a blur of noise and color, but I felt like a ghost, haunting the remnants of my former life. Friends called, concerned by my absence, but I avoided them. What could I say? How could I explain the mess I had made? One evening, I found myself sitting at the dining table, a stack of old photo albums spread out before me. Flipping through the pages, I saw the life James and I had built together: vacations, holidays, quiet moments captured in time. We had been happy, hadn't we? Or had I been fooling myself all along? I closed the album, unable to look at it any longer. The weight of my guilt was unbearable, but I knew I couldn't stay like this forever. Somewhere deep inside, a flicker of resolve began to form. The next morning, I packed a bag and left the house. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. The memories here were too heavy, too suffocating. I needed to find myself again, to understand who I was and what I wanted from life. It wouldn't be easy, I knew that. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and regrets I couldn't erase. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild. Not the life I had before, but something new, something real. The road would be long and lonely, but it was a road I needed to take. As I stepped out into the world, the air felt lighter, freer. The ending of one chapter, I realized, wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of another.